Rachel adjusted the strap of her backpack and scanned the crowd in the lobby of the University of Chicago. She was 18, and everything seemed too loud, too fast. Bags, boxes, students who already knew each other, it was all as oppressive as the August Ohio heat. She clutched the printout of the course registration schedule and made her way to the counter. The line was long, about 20 people, and Rachel took a seat at the very end, careful not to knock anyone's suitcase over. "Hey, are you serious?" The voice behind her sounded sharp, with a slight mockery. Rachel turned around. A tall guy in a plaid shirt and jeans stood with his arms crossed, looking at her with narrowed eyes. In one hand, he held a thermos, in the other, a tattered notebook. "What?" Rachel frowned, trying to figure out what she had done wrong. "You took my place," the guy nodded at the line. "I stepped away for a second to ask about the office, and then you butted in." Rachel glanced around. No one in line was paying attention to them. She adjusted her glasses and stood up straight. "Listen, I didn't see anyone. If this is your place, where are your things?" She nodded at the empty space next to her. The guy smirked as if he caught her on something. "My things? Here they are." He picked up the thermos and the notebook. "That's all I need. But my place, I stood here before you." Rachel felt her cheeks begin to heat up. She didn't want to start her first day at university with an argument, but she wasn't about to give in so easily either. "Okay, let's get this straight," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "You walked away. I came over. The line is moving. If you want, stand behind me. I don't mind." The boy tilted his head as if assessing her. Then he laughed, short and loud. "Okay, Ohio, you're tough. I'm Matt, by the way, from Seattle." He extended his hand, still wearing that ironic smile. Rachel looked at his hand, then at him. She wasn't sure if he was joking or not, but she shook his hand anyway. "Rachel, and I'm not from Ohio, I'm from Columbus." "Columbus, Ohio," Matt shrugged. "Close." "Not really," Rachel rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched upward. "Are you always this persistent?" "Only when someone steals my place." He took a sip from the thermos. "Would you like some coffee? I have a spare cup." "Do you carry an extra cup with you?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. You never know when you'll find a friend in line." He rummages in his backpack, takes out a plastic cup and pours coffee into it. "No sugar, no milk. Real coffee for real people." Rachel took the glass and sniffed. It smelled bitter, but bearable. "Thank you," she said, taking a cautious sip. "Not bad. For someone who argues about the line." Matt chuckled and stood next to her, no longer trying to overtake her. "So what are you taking?" He nodded at her printout. "The courses, I mean." Rachel looked at the piece of paper as if she was seeing it for the first time. "Well, sociology, basic psychology, introductory course in economics." "And you?" "Computer science, of course." Matt tapped his fingers on the notebook. "And sociology, to keep from going crazy with codes. They say it's fun." "Sociology?" Rachel looked at him in surprise. "You don't seem like the type to dig into people's problems." "Have you figured me out yet?" He smirked. "Maybe I just want to understand why people like you steal places in lines." "Oh, come on, this isn't funny anymore," Rachel laughed, taking another sip of coffee. The line moved slowly, but the conversation flowed easily. Matt told stories about Seattle, about the time he almost drowned his laptop in coffee, and Rachel shared a story about how her little brother once buried her algebra book in the garden. By the time they reached the check-in counter, Rachel noticed that her backpack felt lighter, or maybe it was just that she no longer felt lost in the crowd. "So, Ohio," Matt said when they both got their schedules. "See you in sociology." "If you don't argue from behind your desk," Rachel replied, hiding her smile. "No guarantees." He winked and walked towards the auditorium, waving a thermos. Rachel watched him go, clutching her schedule. First day at university, and she wasn't alone. She adjusted her glasses and walked to her first lecture, feeling warm inside and not just from the coffee. A week passed, and Rachel found herself searching for Matt in the crowd on the campus lawn. Sociology had become a shared ritual. They would sit next to each other, share notes, and argue about the theories of Marx and Weber until the professor asked them to shut up. Matt always arrived with a thermos, and Rachel brought her notes, neatly highlighted with colored markers. "Seriously, how many colors do you have in your pencil case?" he asked one day, looking at her notes, where each paragraph was underlined in a different shade. "5," Rachel replied, not looking up from her letter. "Yellow for key ideas, green for examples, blue for quotes, pink for questions, red for conclusions." "You're crazy," Matt shook his head, but there was no judgment in his voice. "Let me see." He reached for her notebook, but Rachel pulled her hand away. "Only if you tell me why you need sociology. You're a coder. Why do you need it?" Matt leaned back in his chair, staring thoughtfully at the ceiling of the classroom. "Honestly, I wanted to understand how people work. Not computers, I already know them. But people, they're more complicated. Half the time I don't understand why they do what they do." Rachel nodded, as if in agreement. "And I wanted to understand how to make the world a little better. Sounds naive, right?" "Not naive," Matt looked at her, and for a second his irony disappeared. "Just ambitious." They were silent until the lecture resumed. After class, Matt suggested going to the cafeteria, and Rachel agreed. They sat at a table by the window, eating sandwiches and arguing over whether Chicago had better pizza than Seattle. Matt insisted, waving his fries, and Rachel laughed so loudly that people turned to look at them. "Have you ever tried Chicago pizza?" she asked, pointing a finger at him. "Once," Matt admitted, "and I'm still all for Seattle. We have seafood on our pizza, Ohio. Seafood." "That's blasphemy," Rachel rolled her eyes, but her laughter betrayed that she was amused. By the end of the month, they were more than just acquaintances. Matt brought her coffee when she was late in the library, and Rachel helped him understand theories about social institutions. They exchanged numbers, and their chat room filled with memes and professor jokes. Rachel found herself waiting for his texts, and Matt began showing up to class a little early to save her a seat. One evening, as they sat in the library, going over another text, Matt suddenly fell silent and looked at her. "What?" Rachel looked up from her book, adjusting her glasses. "Nothing," he shrugged, but his smile was softer than usual. "It's just, you're cool, Ohio." Rachel felt her cheeks flush again, but this time she didn't try to hide her smile. "You're not bad either, Seattle," she said, returning to her book, but her heart was beating a little faster. They left the library late, when the campus had quieted. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the paths, and Rachel noticed that Matt was walking a little closer than usual. She didn't pull away. Rachel sat on the windowsill of her tiny Boston apartment, clutching her phone. It was drizzling outside, and the screen was lit by a text from Matt. "San Francisco is officially trying to kill me. Spent 3 hours today fixing a server that someone spilled an energy drink on." She smiled, imagining him in the server room, disheveled, holding a thermos of coffee. It had been a year since they graduated from the University of Chicago, and they were still hanging on to what had started in the course registration line. "Are you alive in there?" she typed back, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Or have you already become part of the server room?" The answer came a minute later. "Alive. But now I smell like Red Bull. How's your master's degree? Aren't you tired of saving the world?" Rachel chuckled. She was studying social policy in Boston, poring over textbooks and data on inequality. Sometimes she felt like she was drowning in numbers and theories, but texting with Matt brought her back to reality. "I'm just saving my notes from coffee for now," she wrote. "When are you coming?" They agreed to meet every 2 or 3 months. It was expensive airfare, hotels, car rental, but Rachel was already counting the days until their next meeting. Matt worked as a systems architect at a startup in San Francisco, and his schedule was chaotic, but he always found a window for her. A month later, Rachel was waiting for him at Logan Airport. She was nervously fiddling with her watch, looking for him in the crowd. Matt appeared with a backpack over his shoulder, wearing the same plaid shirt he had on when they first met. He noticed her, smiled, and quickened his pace. "Ohio, are you still wearing those glasses?" he said, hugging her so tightly she almost choked. "They're stylish, Seattle," Rachel replied, poking him in the shoulder. "Are you still carrying that thermos?" "He's my lucky charm." Matt held up the thermos like a trophy. "Come on, I'm starving." They took a cab to a small Italian restaurant in the North End. Over pasta and wine, they chatted as if the 3 months apart had never happened. Matt told her about a colleague who had accidentally deleted half a database, and Rachel told her about a professor who lectured as if he was falling asleep. "Listen," Matt said, pushing his plate away. "I was thinking, we can handle this, right? With this distance." Rachel looked at him. There was a slight hesitation in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "We're coping," she replied, covering his hand with hers. "It's hard, but you know I'm not giving up." He smiled and squeezed her fingers. "Good, because I don't plan on letting you go, Ohio." Their meetings became a ritual. Sometimes Matt would fly to Boston, sometimes Rachel would go to San Francisco. They explored the cities like tourists, walking along the Boston waterfront, eating tacos from a food truck in the Mission District, riding bikes across the Golden Gate Bridge. Rachel felt a pang in her chest every time they said goodbye at the airport, but the promise of more kept her going. One winter, Matt came to Boston for the weekend. It was snowing so hard that they were stuck in her apartment. Rachel was making hot chocolate, and Matt was trying to fix her aging space heater. "It's no use," he said, crawling out from under the radiator with a wrench. "You've got last-century technology here." "Don't touch my radiator, it's well-deserved." Rachel threw a kitchen towel at him. "Better tell me, how's your startup going? Haven't they gone broke yet?" "We're holding up for now." He caught the towel and tossed it back. "But I'm starting to think coding is easier than living 3,000 miles away from you." Rachel froze, holding her mug. It was the first thing he had said so directly. "What are you getting at?" she asked, trying to speak lightly. "To the fact that I miss you." Matt stood up, brushing off his jeans. "And to the fact that maybe it's time to think about how to be closer." She nodded, unsure of what to say. They hadn't really talked about the future yet, where they would live, how their lives would turn out. But his words stuck in her head like a melody you couldn't forget. Rachel flew to San Francisco that summer. Matt greeted her with a bouquet of wildflowers, which was very unlike him. "Are you a romantic now?" she teased, sniffing the flowers. "Don't get used to it," he grinned. "I just saw them on the road and thought you'd appreciate them." They spent the weekend walking around the city. On Saturday night, Matt took her up a hill overlooking the bay. They sat on the grass, looking at the city lights, and ate pizza from a box. "You know," Matt said, taking a bite, "I was thinking, if I stay at the startup, they might transfer me. To Chicago, for example. Or even Boston." Rachel turned to him, surprised. "Are you serious? Would you move?" "Well, not right away," he shrugged. "But I don't want to live on FaceTime forever. Do you?" "Me too," she said quietly, looking at his profile in the light of the street lamps. "But I still have 2 years of graduate school. And then, I don't know where I'll work." "We'll figure it out." Matt took her hand. "We always figure it out, Ohio." She smiled, feeling his words warmer than a summer evening. They sat on the hill for a long time, planning how they would travel together when the distance was no longer between them. Rachel imagined them renting an apartment somewhere in the city where they didn't have to count the days until their next flight. By the end of her visit, Matt gave her a small Golden Gate Bridge keychain. "So that you don't forget where to look for me," he said, seeing her off at the airport. "As if I could," Rachel replied, clutching the keychain in her fist. She watched him walk away, and for the first time she thought that the distance wasn't forever. The plane took off, and Rachel still held the keychain, as if it could shorten the thousands of miles between them. When she returned to Boston, a package was waiting for her, a box of coffee beans with a note that read, "For your late-night cramming. Don't drink that crap." Rachel laughed as she opened the box. She set the coffee down on the kitchen table and wrote to Matt, You are insufferable. Thank you. Rachel tightened the laces of her hiking boots and looked down the trail that led up the Cascade Mountains. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on her backpack. She was 28 and had been living with Matt in Seattle for 2 years, where they had moved after she finished grad school. This was their first real camping trip together, not a stroll through the park, but 3 days in the mountains with a tent and minimal gear. Are you sure we won't get lost? She called Matt, who was walking ahead, checking the map on his phone. Relax, Ohio, he said without turning around. I grew up in these parts. If anything happens, the bears will see us out. Very funny, Rachel rolled her eyes, but smiled. She was used to his teasing, though she still found herself blushing at his jokes. They had been walking for 3 hours now, and Rachel's legs were starting to ache. Matt, as always, looked like he could go another 10 miles. His thermos was hanging from the strap of his backpack, and his plaid shirt was unbuttoned halfway through the heat. Let's take a break, Rachel suggested as they came to a small clearing overlooking the valley. She dropped her backpack and plopped down on the grass, pulling out a bottle of water. Matt sat down next to him, wiping sweat from his forehead. Not bad, huh? He said, looking out at the green slopes and distant peaks. Better than your Boston parks. My parkas were great, Rachel countered, nudging him with her shoulder. But yeah, it's beautiful here. Just don't tell me we're going to sleep outside. I saw you pitching a tent yesterday. It was sad. Hey, I'm an engineer, not a scout, Matt laughed. But the tent is up. Don't complain. They fell silent, watching the sunset. The sky turned orange, and Rachel felt the tension of the day melt away. She loved moments like these with Matt, when you didn't have to say anything, just be there. You know, he began, looking off into the distance, I was thinking, we're doing pretty well, aren't we? Rachel turned to him, trying to figure out what he was getting at. Are we coping? With the hike? Or are you talking about the fact that I haven't escaped from your jokes yet? About us, Matt looked at her, his usual irony gone. About all of this. You, me, the moves, the distance. We've been through a lot. Rachel nodded. She remembered their years of long distance, the endless calls, the flights across the country. Now they lived together, but they were still learning how to be a couple without thousands of miles between them. Yes, we did, she said quietly, looking away to the horizon. And I don't regret anything. Matt fell silent, and Rachel felt him shift beside her. She turned to see him taking something out of his backpack pocket, a small box wrapped in worn fabric. What is it? She asked, feeling her heart beat faster. Matt opened the box, and inside was a ring, simple and silver, with a small stone. He looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, almost vulnerable. Rachel, he said, his voice breaking, I don't want to wonder anymore where we'll be in a year or two. I want us to be together. Always marry me. Rachel froze. She looked at the ring, at his face, at the mountains around her. Everything seemed too big, too real. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Are you serious? She finally breathed out, her voice louder than she expected. When am I not serious? Matt smiled, but his hand holding the box was shaking slightly. Well, except when I tease you about your colored markers. Rachel laughed, and the tension burst like a bubble. She felt tears in the corners of her eyes, but they were good tears. Yes, she said, nodding. Yes, I will marry you. Matt let out a breath, as if he had just begun to breathe. He took her hand and slipped the ring on, his fingers warm and a little awkward. Then he hugged her, and Rachel buried her face in his shirt, breathing in the scent of pine and coffee. You won't change your mind? He asked, pulling back to look her in the eyes. Nah, she replied, wiping her cheek. But if you spill coffee on my laptop again, I'll think about it. Fair enough. Matt laughed and kissed her, briefly, but so warmly that she felt it all the way to her fingertips. They sat in the clearing until the sun sank behind the mountains. Matt pulled 2 cans of soda from his backpack, his camping champagne, he said. They clinked glasses, laughed, and started talking about the future. Rachel imagined a wedding, maybe by the water, and Matt joked that he wouldn't wear a tie even if she made him. I want it to be simple, Rachel said, looking at the ring that still felt foreign on her finger. No big ceremony. Agreed, Matt nodded, but I'm choosing the cake. As long as it doesn't have seafood, she teased, recalling their old argument about pizza. They returned to the tent just as it was getting dark. Matt had lit a fire, and they were eating canned beans straight from the can, passing them around. Rachel watched the fire and thought she had never felt so calm. She stole a glance at Matt, who was trying to open another can, cursing when the knife slipped. "Give it here, engineer," she said, taking the jar and opening it in one motion. "Show off," he grumbled, but smiled. They lay in the tent, listening to the wind rustle through the pines. Rachel snuggled close to Matt, feeling the warmth of his body. She thought about how far they had come from that line in Chicago and how much further they had to go. The ring on her finger was light, but it felt like it held all their years together. As she fell asleep, Matt whispered, "Good night, future Mrs. Ohio." Rachel snorted but didn't open her eyes. "Good night, Seattle," she muttered, falling asleep to the crackling fire. Rachel stood in front of the mirror in the small room of the glass pavilion, adjusting her dress. It was simple, white, off the shoulder, without unnecessary lace. Rain pounded the roof, and through the picture windows she could see the gray Puget Sound. She was 28, and today she was marrying Matt. She took a deep breath, trying to stop her fingers from shaking. "You look like someone who's about to run away," her friend Liz said, smoothing her hair. Liz had flown in from Ohio and had been bustling around all day, checking flowers and the guest list. "I'm not running away," Rachel said, but her voice shook. This is all so weird. I'm not used to being the center of attention." "Relax," Liz grinned, handing her a glass of water. "Everyone will be looking at Matt. He promised to wear a tie." Rachel laughed at the image of Matt in a suit. He hated formal wear, but for her sake he'd agreed to wear a navy jacket and even a tie, even though he grumbled that it was a noose for engineers. There were footsteps outside the door and Rachel's father walked in. His eyes sparkled when he saw her. "Ratch, you." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You look like your mother these days." Rachel smiled, feeling a lump in her throat. Her mother had died when she was 10, and her father had rarely spoken of her. But today, he looked at her as if he saw them both. "Dad, you promised not to cry," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm not crying," he cleared his throat, looking away. "I just got the ocean in my eyes." Rachel laughed. Her father had always dreamed of seeing the ocean, and Matt had specifically chosen the pavilion by the bay so that he could stand on the water. She knew it was his gift not only to her, but to her father as well. "Come on," he said, offering her his arm. "Your boyfriend is already nervous." They walked out into the ballroom where 80 guests had gathered. The rain continued to fall, but the room was warm and bright. Strings of light bulbs hung from the ceiling, and simple bouquets of wildflowers decorated the tables Rachel had insisted on them, remembering the same ones Matt had given her in San Francisco. She saw him at the altar, hunched over slightly, fiddling with the cuff of his jacket. When their eyes met, he smiled that ironic smile that always made her heart skip a beat. "You're late, Ohio," he whispered as she approached. "You're wearing a tie, Seattle," she replied, trying not to smile too widely. The ceremony began. The officiant, an older woman with a kind smile, spoke of love and promises. Rachel barely listened. She looked at Matt, at his slightly disheveled hair, at the way he squeezed her hand. When it was time for the vows, Matt pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I told you I wasn't a wordsmith," he began, and the guests laughed. "But Rachel, you made me believe I could be better than I am. You argued with me about the line in Chicago, and I'm still glad I lost that argument. I promise to be there for you even when you underline your notes in 5 different colors." The guests laughed again, and Rachel felt tears sting her eyes. She took a breath and began her vows. "Matt, you've always been my most stubborn friend," she said, her voice shaking slightly. You brought me coffee in the library and tolerated my lectures on social theory. I promise to be there for you even if you spill coffee on my laptop again." He grinned, and she saw his eyes glitter. They exchanged rings, and when the waiter pronounced them husband and wife, Matt kissed her as if they were the only two people in the room. The guests clapped, some whistled, and Rachel's father surreptitiously wiped his eyes. After the ceremony, the reception began. Matt insisted on local beer and Seattle-style appetizers, mini burgers, fries, oysters. Rachel walked among the guests, hugging college friends and Matt's colleagues. Her father stood at the window, looking out over the bay, and she approached him. "So how do you like the ocean?" she asked, putting her arm around his shoulders. "More than I thought," he replied, not taking his eyes off the water. "Thanks, Ratch. And that guy of yours, too." "He's not just a guy anymore, Dad," she smiled. I know," he patted her hand. "He's a good one. Hold on to him." Matt found her just as the dancing was starting, looking a little out of place, but he held out his hand anyway. "I told you that dancing is not my thing," he grumbled when they reached the landing. "And I told you that you would survive," Rachel replied, placing her hands on his shoulders. They moved slowly to the song Rachel had chosen, something soft with guitar chords. Matt held her waist, and she could feel the warmth of his palms through her dress. "You don't regret it?" he asked quietly as they circled. "About what? About you almost breaking your tie?" she teased. "About everything." He looked into her eyes. "This is forever, Ohio." Rachel squeezed his hand. "I don't regret it, Seattle. Not for a second." The evening ended late. The rain had died down and the guests were beginning to leave. Rachel and Matt stood at the entrance to the pavilion, seeing off the last of their friends. She looked at the ring on her finger. It no longer seemed foreign. Matt took her hand and they walked outside, where the air smelled of wet grass and the sea. "Ready for your honeymoon?" he asked, opening the taxi door. "Only if you don't make me climb the mountains again," she replied, getting into the car. Matt laughed and sat down next to her, putting his arm around her shoulders. The taxi pulled away, taking them into the night, and Rachel looked out the window, feeling like it was just beginning. She snuggled into Matt and closed her eyes, listening to him hum the tune of their first dance. Rachel stood on the porch of the red porched house, holding a box of dishes. The Austin sun was hot on her neck, and the air smelled of dust and freshly mown grass. She and Matt had just moved from Seattle. His company had transferred him to the Texas office, and Rachel had found a job as a project manager at a nonprofit that focused on education access. Boxes were piled in the living room, and she was already wishing she'd settled for this house instead of an apartment. "Hey, Ohio, are you just going to stand there or bring that inside?" Matt called from the back of the house. He was fiddling with the coffee table, trying to put it together without instructions. "I'm admiring the view, Seattle," Rachel replied, but she walked into the house anyway, setting the box down. "Are you sure we can handle this place? It's huge." "Huge?" Matt wiped the sweat from his forehead and grinned. "It's 3 bedrooms and a yard. We're not buying a ranch." "Bye," she teased, unpacking the plates. "But I see you're already planning a backyard barbecue." "Guilty." He raised his hands in surrender. "But only if you don't make me cook your vegan something or other." Rachel threw a tea towel at him, and he caught it deftly, laughing. They spent the day sorting through boxes and arguing over where to hang their old map of Chicago. By evening, the house was starting to take shape. The couch was in place, the bed was made, and the kitchen smelled like the pizza they'd ordered because no one wanted to cook. A week later, another variable entered their lives, a golden retriever named Bailey. Rachel found him at a shelter, where she went just to look. At first, Matt grumbled that a dog was too much, but within a day, he was scratching Bailey behind the ear while he chewed on his old sneaker. "You said you didn't want a dog," Rachel said, watching Matt throw a ball to Bailey in the yard. "I said I didn't want the responsibility," he corrected, dodging the dog as it lunged. "But this guy's clearly smarter than me, so I'm giving in." Rachel laughed, leaning against the doorframe. She loved these moments when she and Matt were just themselves, with no rush or agenda. Life in Austin was starting to settle into a rhythm. In the mornings, Rachel went to yoga at a nearby studio while Matt drank coffee and checked work emails. In the afternoons, she drove to the office, where she coordinated grants and donor meetings, while Matt disappeared into his office, setting up systems for clients. They spent their evenings together, cooking dinner, watching movies, or walking around the neighborhood with Bailey. One Saturday was particularly hot, and Matt suggested they go to Lady Bird Lake. They took the bikes they'd bought at a yard sale and rode along the trail along the water. Rachel rode ahead, her hair flying, and Matt yelled from behind, "Hey, slow down. Not everyone here is from the Tour de France." "Then catch up, engineer," she answered without turning around. They stopped at a bench to get a drink of water. Bailey, tied to a tree, barked at the ducks swimming nearby. Rachel looked at Matt, who was leaning back, holding a bottle of water, looking out at the water. "What?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Nothing," he shrugged. I like it. Us, Austin, all of it. It feels like home." Rachel nodded, feeling warmth in her chest. "Yes," she said quietly, "like home." They began to settle into the neighborhood. Their neighbors, an older couple named Dan and Martha, invited them to a barbecue. Rachel brought her signature salad, and Matt helped Dan with the grill, although he admitted he didn't know much about steak. "You're from Seattle," Dan said, turning the meat. "Do they fry fish there?" "We eat fish raw," Matt replied with a serious look. "Sushi, you know." Rachel rolled her eyes, but Martha laughed and winked at her. "Keep him in check, dear," she said. "He's the kind of man who'll argue about everything." "Oh, I know," Rachel said, looking at Matt. "He argued with me about a place in line once." Matt smirked, tossing Bailey a piece of bread. And I was right, Ohio. Life was moving along smoothly. Rachel loved her new job. She felt like her work at a nonprofit was making a real difference. Matt, though he grumbled about Austin's heat, was finding his job increasingly interesting. They made plans, maybe get another dog, or go to Mexico, or fix up the backyard. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, sipping cold beers and listening to Bailey snore at their feet. One day, Rachel came home from work to find Matt in the kitchen. He was trying to make tacos, but half the filling was on the counter, not in the tortillas. "Is this a culinary apocalypse?" she asked, throwing her bag on a chair. "It's an experiment," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "I want to beat your restaurant tacos." "Dream on, Seattle." Rachel took a piece of avocado from the table and ate it. "But you get a plus for trying." They sat down to eat, laughing at his culinary failures. Bailey squirmed under the table, hoping for a treat. Rachel looked at Matt, at his disheveled hair and the sauce stains on his shirt, and thought, this is Ithapenis not perfect, but their own. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "What is this for?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just like that," she answered, smiling. When they went to bed, Rachel snuggled up to Matt, listening to Bailey snore in the corner of the room. The cicadas sang outside the window, and she thought that this house, this town, this man, all belonged to her. She closed her eyes, feeling his breath on her neck, and fell asleep smiling. Rachel woke to the sound of Bailey barking as he ran around the backyard chasing a squirrel. Austin's morning sun streamed into the bedroom, and she stretched, feeling her muscles ache from the previous day's yoga. It had been 3 years since they'd moved in, and life with Matt in the house with the red porch had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She put on her sneakers and went for a run while Matt was still asleep, hugging his pillow. "Squirrel hunting again," she called Bailey as she opened the back door. The dog wagged his tail and ran up, nuzzling her hand with his wet nose. Rachel ran along the familiar route, past neat lawns and blooming magnolias. She loved these morning minutes, just her, the warm air, and the rhythm of her steps. When she returned, she found Matt in the kitchen, pouring coffee into his ever-present thermos, already wearing jeans and a t-shirt with his company logo. "Good morning, champ," he said, handing her a mug. "How are your legs? Are they still aching from the yoga? Still holding up, Rachel replied, taking a sip. And you? Up until midnight coding again? Guilty, he shrugged. A client on the East Coast caused a panic. Had to be rescued. Rachel nodded, accustomed to his late shifts. She often stayed late at the office, planning fundraisers or reviewing grant proposals. Their days were filled with work, but they tried to make time for each other. On Saturdays, they biked to Lady Bird Lake, and in the evenings they had movie marathons with nachos and beer. One Saturday was particularly lazy. They decided not to go anywhere and had a barbecue in the yard. Matt was busy with the grill, and Rachel was chopping vegetables for a salad. Bailey was lying at her feet, hoping for a piece of carrot. Listen, Matt said, flipping burgers. Dan and Martha invited us to poker tomorrow. How are you? Poker? Rachel raised an eyebrow. You even lost to me at Uno. That was one time, he said indignantly, poking her with a shovel. And I was distracted by your stupid rules. Rules? She laughed, throwing a cucumber slice at him. You're just not a good loser, Seattle. He caught the cucumber and ate it demonstratively, grinning. They sat down to eat as the sun set, painting the sky pink. Bailey hovered around, begging for a piece of bread. Rachel looked at Matt, his hair a little longer than usual, and the first wrinkles of laughter appeared at the corners of his eyes. She suddenly thought that this was their life. Simple, warm, their own. But something was changing. Rachel noticed it in small ways. She came home later than she'd promised because another donor wanted a presentation by morning. Matt began taking more night shifts, sitting at his laptop until 3 in the morning. Their conversations, previously full of jokes and plans, increasingly turned to everyday matters. Are you picking up Bailey from the groomer tomorrow? She asked one evening, leafing through work emails on the couch. Yeah, if you remind me in the morning, Matt replied, not looking up from the screen. I have a client call at 7. Okay, Rachel said, but her voice was quieter than usual. She looked at him, at the light from the monitor reflecting off his glasses. She wanted to say something, to bring back their old conversations, but she just sighed and went back to her letters. Bailey lay down between them, his head in her lap. One day they went to Lady Bird Lake, but instead of going for a bike ride, they just sat on a bench. Rachel looked at the water, and Matt checked something on his phone. Is everything okay? She asked, noticing his frown. Yeah, just work, he shrugged. New project, lots of bugs. And you? The same, she said, though she wanted to say more. The fundraiser is next week. I need to prepare a speech. You can do it, he said, but his gaze remained on the screen. Rachel nodded, feeling the silence between them. Not the comfortable, mountain-like silence, but a heavy one, as if they had forgotten how to really talk. She patted Bailey on the head, and the dog licked her hand as if trying to comfort her. They watched a movie that night, but Rachel couldn't concentrate. She thought about how their lives had quietly become routine, pleasant, but monotonous. She still loved Matt, loved their house, loved their dog, but something inside her was beginning to yearn for the days when they'd argue over pizza or laugh until they cried in the library. Why are you so quiet? Matt asked as they got into bed. Just tired, she replied, turning on her side. Good night. Nice Ohio, he said, but his voice was distracted. Rachel lay in the darkness, listening to Bailey snore in the corner. She felt something slipping away, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She closed her eyes, hoping for clarity in the morning, and snuggled into her pillow, as if it could hold on to the warmth of their old days. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. It was 10 o'clock at night, and she was still editing a presentation for the next day's fundraiser. Bailey was asleep at her feet, snoring, and the house was unusually quiet. Matt was working late again. It had been 6 years since they'd been married, and the cozy rhythm of their Austin life was beginning to falter. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, and glanced at Matt's empty thermos, forgotten on the table. The door slammed and Bailey looked up. Matt had walked in, dropping his backpack by the door. His shirt was rumpled and there were shadows under his eyes. "Hello," he said, heading for the refrigerator. "Are you still awake?" "I'm not sleeping," Rachel replied, not looking up from the screen. "Big day tomorrow. Donor presentation." "Oh, right." He took out a bottle of beer and sat down opposite. "How are your saviors of the world?" "Fine," she shrugged, feeling annoyed. She wanted him to ask more, but Matt just nodded and took a sip. "I'm having fun too," he said, looking into the bottle. "The server went down. I had to spend 3 hours digging through the logs. The clients were screaming as if I had personally broken everything for them." "I'm so sorry," Rachel said, but her voice sounded mechanical. She closed her laptop and looked at him. "Do you ever take a day off?" "Someday," he grinned, but it sounded tired. "And you live in the office now." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but then stopped. He was right. She worked late most days, planning campaigns, calling donors, checking reports. She loved her work, but it was draining, leaving little time for her and Matt. "We have to," she said simply, standing up to put away her laptop. "Otherwise, we won't get anything done." Matt nodded but didn't answer. He finished his beer and went to take a shower, and Rachel stayed in the kitchen, listening to Bailey whine in his sleep. She suddenly remembered how she and Matt had sat here, laughing at his attempts at making tacos. Now their conversations were limited to schedules and tired sighs. The next morning, Rachel left for the office early. The fundraiser had gone smoothly. Donors had pledged funding, colleagues had patted her on the back, but she felt empty. When she got home, she found Matt on the couch with his laptop. Bailey was lying next to him, chewing on a toy. "How did it go?" Matt asked, not looking up from the screen. "Okay," she replied, taking off her shoes. "We raised more than we expected." "Cool," he nodded, but his fingers continued to tap on the keys. Rachel looked at him, expecting him to ask for details, but he remained silent. She went into the kitchen to make tea and felt irritation building inside her. She wanted him to put the laptop down so they could talk like they used to, but she didn't know how to start. "Are you up until night again?" she asked, trying to sound neutral. "Yeah," he answered. "New release. If I don't finish it, tomorrow will be hell." "I see." Rachel squeezed the mug, feeling the warmth burn her fingers. "Maybe we can go somewhere this weekend, to the lake, for example." "We'll see," he said without looking up. "I might have a call on Saturday." She nodded, but her smile was strained. They hadn't been to Lady Bird Lake in a couple of months. It used to be their tradition, but now they barely found time to eat together. Rachel went into the bedroom, leaving him with the laptop, and lay down, staring at the ceiling. Bailey jumped up on the bed and nuzzled her hand. "You at least understand me, right?" she whispered, scratching him behind the ear. The next few weeks were much the same. Rachel threw herself into her work. A new project to support inner-city schools demanded her attention. She went to meetings, prepared reports, and presented them to the board. At home, she collapsed on the couch, too tired to cook or speak. Matt, too, lived his life in his own rhythm. He took on more and more night shifts because his team was working with clients on the East Coast. Sometimes they only saw each other in the morning, exchanging a few words before going their separate ways. One evening, Rachel came home to find Matt in the kitchen, eating cold pizza straight from the box, standing at the sink. "Couldn't you warm it up?" she asked, throwing her bag on a chair. "I didn't have time," he replied, shrugging his shoulders. "I just got here. Why are you so angry?" "I'm not angry." Rachel felt her voice sharpen. "I'm just tired, and I'm tired of coming to an empty house." "What, should I quit my job?" Matt put the box on the table. "I have deadlines, Rachel. You know that." "I'm not out either," she snapped. "But at least I'm trying to make time for us." "Trying?" He raised an eyebrow. "You're in the office until midnight. When was the last time we had a normal conversation?" Rachel opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She wanted to say that she missed their evenings, their jokes, but instead she just shook her head. "Forget it," she said, going into the bedroom. Matt didn't follow her. She heard him turn on the TV and felt something inside her clench. Bailey nudged her knees and she hugged him, burying her face in his fur. A few days later, she and Matt went to a barbecue at Dan and Martha's. Rachel hoped the change of scenery would help. They sat in the neighbor's yard, eating ribs and listening to old rock. Martha talked about their recent trip to Mexico, and Dan teased Matt about his love of coffee. "Seriously, man, do you ever drink water?" Dan asked, pouring himself some lemonade. "Water is watered-down coffee," Matt replied, and everyone laughed. Rachel smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. She looked at Matt, at his familiar smirk, and tried to remember the last time they had laughed like that together. She sipped her wine, listening to the conversation, but she felt detached, as if she were looking at everything through glass. "Are you okay?" Martha asked when they were left in the kitchen, clearing away the plates. "Yeah, just tired," Rachel replied, forcing a smile. "Work." "I know how it feels," Martha patted her shoulder. "But stick together, okay? You and Matt make a good team." Rachel nodded, but Martha's words only made the emptiness inside her worse. She went back to the courtyard, where Matt was telling Dan about some bug in the code. She sat down next to him, but he didn't even look at her. At home, they went to bed in silence. Rachel lay staring into the darkness, listening to Matt breathe next to her. She wanted to turn to him, to say something, but she didn't know how. Instead, she stood up, picked up her phone, and began scrolling through her work emails. Bailey sighed and rolled over, as if sensing her anxiety. The next day, Rachel stayed at the office until midnight, finalizing the budget for a new project. When she returned, Matt was asleep on the couch, his laptop still open on his lap. She covered him with a blanket and went to bed alone. In the morning, he left for work without waking her, and Rachel found a note on his desk. "I'll pick up Bailey from the groomer. See you tonight." She crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. She wanted to scream at him to stop so they could talk, but she just grabbed her bag and drove to the office. In the car, she turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but even the music didn't help. Rachel parked outside the office, gripped the steering wheel, and closed her eyes, feeling something in their lives begin to crumble at the seams. Rachel sat in the conference room of her Austin office, flipping through a folder of reports. It was a blazing July afternoon outside, and the air conditioner was humming, trying to keep the heat at bay. Her team was gearing up for a new project, a partnership with Veterans Foundations, and a new communications specialist was coming in today. She rubbed her eyes tiredly as she drank the last of her cold coffee. The last few months with Matt had been like running in place. They saw each other, but they didn't seem to notice each other. The door opened, and her colleague Tom walked in with a man Rachel hadn't seen before. He was slightly above average height, with short dark hair and a light stubble. He was wearing a simple white shirt and jeans, and was holding a tablet. "Rachel, this is Eric, our new liaison officer," Tom said, nodding toward the man. "Eric, this is Rachel, our project manager. She runs things around here." "Hello," Eric extended his hand, his smile warm but reserved. "I hear you're keeping this circus under control." Rachel shook his hand, noticing how tightly he squeezed it. "I'll try," she replied, smiling. "Welcome to the team. I hope you're ready for chaos." "Chaos is my element," he said, squinting. 7 years in the Marines. If I survive that, I can handle your reports." She laughed, and the tension she'd been carrying around all day eased a little. Eric sat down at the table, and they began discussing the project. He spoke clearly, with a slight military accent, and caught on quickly. Rachel noticed that he was taking notes by hand instead of on a clipboard, and for some reason that surprised her. "Do you always write like this?" she asked when they had finished their discussion. "Yeah," he tapped his pen on the notebook. "An old habit. In the field, laptops don't always save the day." "I see," Rachel nodded, her curiosity growing. "What brought you from the Marines to a nonprofit?" Eric shrugged, but his gaze became more serious. "I wanted to do something that made sense. There," he nodded off to the side. "It was all about orders. Here I can help people without breaking anything. Rachel looked at him, and something about his words struck a chord with her. She wanted her job to make a difference too, but lately it was all about deadlines and numbers. Then we're on the same page, she said, closing the folder. Come on, I'll show you the office. They started working together almost immediately. Eric was not only a good specialist, but also a person with whom it was easy to find a common language. He brought coffee before morning meetings, always black, without sugar, and teased her about her habit of drinking lattes. Seriously, Rachel, this isn't coffee, it's dessert, he said one day, placing a paper cup in front of her. It's called taste, she replied, taking a sip. Not everyone drinks resin like you. He laughed, and his laugh was deep, genuine, and Rachel found herself smiling back, even though she had felt drained all day. At home, everything was the same. Matt would come home late, often with his laptop under his arm, and immediately start working. Rachel tried to start a conversation, but his answers were short and distracted. "How is your day?" she asked one day, placing a plate of dinner in front of him. "It's fine," he replied, without looking up from the screen. "And you?" "Also," she said, but her voice was quieter than usual. She wanted to tell them about the new project, about Eric, who was already part of their team, but Matt nodded and went back to his code. Rachel went to wash the dishes, feeling a growing emptiness inside her. Bailey nuzzled her knee, and she scratched him behind the ear. "At least you're listening, right?" she muttered, looking at the dog. Working with Eric became increasingly intense. They spent 12-hour days in the office, preparing presentations for sponsors and traveling to meetings. Eric was a master communicator. He could lighten the mood with a joke or turn difficult issues into light conversation. Rachel noticed how the sponsors relaxed when he spoke, and how he always knew what to say. One night, they were in the office late, finalizing a report. The lights were dim, and the street lights were already on outside. Rachel stretched tiredly, and Eric sat across from her, leafing through papers. "Do you ever sleep?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes," she answered, smiling. "And you? You have army discipline." "I was," he chuckled. "Now I'm a victim of coffee and deadlines, just like you." Rachel laughed, and they began to chat about light things music, the time he'd been stranded in the desert with a broken-down Jeep. She found herself listening with an interest she hadn't felt in a long time. Eric spoke with ease but without bragging, and his stories were a breath of fresh air after her routine days. "And you?" he asked, looking at her. "What keeps you in this office until midnight?" Rachel hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She could have said something about the project, about wanting to help, but instead she shrugged. "I guess I just don't want to let you down," she said. "Why are you here?" "Because it's important," he replied, his voice growing more serious. "And because working with you isn't so bad." She looked at him, and their eyes met for a second. Rachel felt a warmth in her chest, but quickly looked away, focusing on the papers. "Okay, let's finish this," she said, trying to sound businesslike. "Otherwise, we'll be sitting here until the morning." Eric nodded, but his smile remained. They finished the report, and he offered to give her a ride home. Rachel declined, saying she could get there on her own, but she was still thinking about his words as she sat in the car. At home, Matt was asleep on the couch, his laptop open on his lap. She covered him with a blanket and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out why her thoughts kept returning to Eric. A week later, she and Eric went to a conference in Houston. They sat in a cafe before the presentation, discussing the slides. Eric ordered coffee for them both, and Rachel noticed that he remembered how much she liked her latte. "Are you following me?" she teased, taking the glass. "Just observant," he replied with a wink. "An army habit." They laughed, and Rachel felt her shoulders relax. Eric was easy, he didn't ask anything of her except to be herself. They spent the day at the conference, moving from one session to the next, and by the evening they were both exhausted but in good spirits. "Listen," Eric said as they left the building, We have an hour before the sponsor's dinner. Let's go find something decent to eat. I won't survive on their canapés. Rachel agreed, and they went to a small bar nearby. They ordered burgers and beers, and the conversation flowed naturally. Eric told her stories about his service, about how he once spent a night under the stars in Iraq, and Rachel shared a story about how she accidentally enrolled in a philosophy course in college and almost failed it. Philosophy? Eric laughed. You're all about specifics. How did you get there? Don't ask, she rolled her eyes. I thought it would be easy, and then I listened to Kant for 3 hours and wanted to run away. He laughed, and Rachel found herself enjoying his laugh. When they returned to the hotel, she felt a little disappointed that the evening was over. They said goodbye at the elevator, and Rachel went to her room, but her thoughts were still swirling around their conversation. At home, Matt met her with dinner. He ordered Chinese food, which was rare. They ate in the kitchen, and Rachel tried to tell her about the conference, but Matt interrupted her, starting to talk about his project. Look, I'm glad everything went great for you, he said, but I've got a mess going on here. New client, and they want to redo everything in a week. Rachel nodded, but her smile was strained. She wanted to talk about Eric, about how he had helped her with her presentation, but the words stuck. Instead, she cleared the dishes and went to bed, feeling the distance between her and Matt growing. She closed her eyes, but Eric's face, his easy smile, kept popping into her head, and she pushed the thoughts away, wrapping her arms around Bailey, who was sleeping at her feet. Rachel parked the car in the driveway and turned off the engine. The lights were on in the house, and she knew Matt was home from work. She clutched her phone in her hand, feeling the screen still warm from Eric's recent text. See you tomorrow, partner. Since that night in Dallas, when a snowstorm had trapped them in the same room, her life had been split in two. By day, she was Matt's wife, and by night, someone who hid secrets in encrypted chats. She took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked into the house, trying to look normal. Matt was sitting on the couch, scrolling through something on his laptop. Bailey was lying next to him, his head on his lap. The dog wagged his tail when he saw Rachel, but didn't move. Hey, Matt said, not looking up from the screen. You're late. Yes, Rachel replied, throwing her bag on a chair. I was late with the report. How are you? It's fine, he shrugged. The new client is redoing everything again. I'll have to sit through the night. Rachel nodded, feeling the familiar emptiness growing inside her. She wanted to say something, to ask about his day, but instead she went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. While the water was boiling, she pulled out her phone and opened Signal. Eric had sent another message. Forgot to tell you, your budget slide was awesome. The sponsors loved it. She smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest, and quickly replied, Thank you. You were awesome too. Would you like some tea? She shouted to Matt, putting the phone in her pocket. No, I'm going for coffee, he answered from the living room. There's a thermos on the table if you want it. She looked at his thermos, sitting in its usual place, and felt a pang of guilt. She poured herself some tea and went back into the living room, sitting on the other end of the sofa. Bailey crawled over to her, resting his head on her lap. How's your project going? Matt asked, closing his laptop. Still saving the world? I'm trying, she replied, patting Bailey. We presented it to the sponsors today. It looks like they'll give us more than we asked for. Cool, he said, but his voice was distracted. He reached for the remote. Want to watch something? I found a new show. Maybe tomorrow, Rachel answered, standing up. I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed. Okay, he nodded, turning on the TV. Good night. Rachel went into the bedroom, leaving him with the show. She got into bed, but instead of sleeping, she pulled out her phone. Eric had sent another text. Hey, have you heard the new Foo Fighters album? Reminds me of our argument in Dallas. She smiled, remembering how they'd argued about music while the storm roared outside. She texted back, I have, but Springsteen is still better. They texted for another half hour until Rachel heard Matt turn off the TV and go into the bedroom. She quickly locked her phone and pretended to be asleep. He lay down next to her, not touching her, and soon his breathing became even. Rachel lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she had it under control. It was just flirting, nothing serious. She still loved Matt. But she couldn't stop thinking about Eric. The next day at the office, she and Eric were working on a new report. They sat in a conference room, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. Eric was telling her about his latest trip, and Rachel found herself laughing more than she should have. "Are you always this talkative?" she asked, tossing him a pen. "Only when there's someone listening," he replied, catching the pen. "And you? You seem to be all about seriousness and taking notes." "I'm a multitasker," she said, smiling. "I can be serious and listen to your stories at the same time." He laughed, and their eyes met for a second longer than they should have. Rachel looked away, concentrating on the papers. She could feel her pulse quickening, and it scared her. But at the same time, it was a breath of fresh air after months of fatigue. At home, she tried to be her old self. She made the risotto Matt liked and even suggested watching that show he'd been talking about. They sat on the couch, eating and laughing at the jokes on the show, but Rachel felt like she was playing a role. Her thoughts kept returning to Eric, to his easy smile, to the way he'd looked at her in the conference room. "Why are you so thoughtful?" Matt asked as they cleared away the dishes. "I'm just tired," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Work." "I know that feeling," he said, wiping his hands. "I have another call tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Time to sleep." Rachel nodded, but when he went into the bedroom, she stayed in the kitchen. She opened Signal and texted Eric, "You were right about the album, but don't get cocky." The reply came almost immediately, "Too late, I'm already the king of music taste." She laughed, and it was liberating. Their texting became a ritual. Rachel would text him late at night when Matt was asleep, or during lunch breaks, hiding her phone under the table. They discussed everything from music to work to old movies they both loved. Eric would send her memes, and she would find herself waiting for his messages with an anticipation she hadn't felt with Matt in a long time. A month later, she and Eric went to another conference, this time in San Antonio. They spent their days giving presentations and their evenings at bars, discussing everything from politics to how to eat tacos. One night, after a dinner with sponsors, they ended up staying at the bar. Eric ordered them beers, and they chatted until the bar began to empty. "Listen," he said, looking at her, "did you ever think you'd be doing this? You know, fundraisers, conferences, all that running around?" Rachel shrugged, twirling the bottle in her hands. "Not really," she admitted. "In college, I thought I was going to, I don't know, change the world. Now I'm just trying not to drown in reports." "You do more than you think," he said, his voice serious. "I've seen the way you talk to sponsors. You fire them up." Rachel felt her cheeks warm and took a sip of beer to hide her embarrassment. "And you?" she asked. "You could have stayed in the army. Why did you choose this?" "I wanted to build something, not destroy it," he replied, looking away. "And, you know, working with you, it makes everything easier." She looked at him, and for a second the world around her froze. His words were simple, but there was something in them that made her heart beat faster. She looked away, feeling guilt and excitement mingle inside her. "Let's go," she said, getting up. "We have to get up early tomorrow." Eric nodded, and they left the bar. It was chilly outside, and Rachel pulled her jacket tight around her. They walked to the hotel in silence, but she felt his presence next to her like an electric shock. They said goodbye at the elevator, and Rachel went to her room, but her thoughts remained with him. At home, she continued to play the part. She planned the renovation of the guest bedroom, laughed at the memes Matt sent, and cooked dinners. But every time her phone buzzed, she felt a rush of adrenaline. Eric texted less often, but his messages were like sparks, short but bright. She convinced herself that it was just friendship, that she had it all under control. But when she looked at Matt sleeping next to her, her heart clenched with guilt. One evening, she sat in her car in the office parking lot, texting Eric. He sent a voicemail. Miss our arguments. When's the next conference? His voice was warm, and Rachel smiled as she wrote down a reply. Soon, if the sponsors don't bail. She sent the message and looked at the ring on her finger. It was still there, but it felt heavier than before. She returned home where Matt was watching basketball. He smiled at her, but his eyes were tired. Is it a nice day? He asked. Yes, she answered, sitting down next to him. And you? The usual, he shrugged. Want to order pizza? Rachel nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She was looking at the TV screen, but she could see Eric's face, his smile, his gaze. She clutched her phone in her pocket and tried to focus on the game, but everything inside her screamed that she was teetering on the edge. Bailey lay down at her feet, and she stroked him, hoping his warmth would help her forget about what she couldn't control. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, chopping vegetables for a salad. Bailey lay at her feet, whining for a piece of carrot. Austin's spring sun streamed through the window, but the house was quiet. Matt hadn't returned from work yet. She tried to focus on dinner, but her thoughts kept wandering to Eric. Their last signal conversation, a quick exchange of jokes about the conference in Tulsa, was still playing in her head. She tried to convince herself that it was just friendship, but every time her phone vibrated, her pulse quickened. The door slammed and Bailey looked up. Matt had walked in, dropping his backpack by the door. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and he was holding his ever-present thermos. He looked tired, but his gaze was more alert than usual. Hello, he said, placing the thermos on the table. What are you cooking? Salad and pasta, Rachel answered, trying to sound light. Want to help? Maybe later. He sat down opposite, opening his laptop. I need to send a couple of emails. Rachel nodded, but noticed him glance at her briefly before looking back at the screen. Something about his silence struck her as odd, but she pushed the thought aside and returned to her cutting. They ate in silence, broken only by the clanking of forks and Bailey's occasional commands for him to stop begging for food. How's work? She asked, trying to break the silence. Same as always, Matt replied, not looking up. And you? Still fighting with sponsors? Yeah, she said, smiling. The new project is in full swing. Another trip is coming soon. Where? He asked, his voice even, but there was something in it that made Rachel tense. Tulsa, she answered, trying not to show her excitement. A conference on veterans' funds. Matt nodded, but his fingers froze on his fork. He looked at her, and Rachel felt her heart beat faster. She quickly looked away, focusing on her plate. You've been kind of different lately, he said, putting down his fork. Is everything okay? Rachel froze, feeling the blood rush to her cheeks. She forced herself to smile. Yeah, it's okay, she replied, shrugging. It's just that work is exhausting. He nodded, but his gaze remained on her. Rachel stood up to clear away the dishes and felt her phone in her pocket as if it were heavier. She knew there was an unread message from Eric, but she didn't dare check. Over the next few days, Matt acted as usual, but Rachel noticed little things. He glanced at her more often when he thought she wasn't looking. One night, she caught him looking as she turned off notifications on her phone before going to bed. He didn't say anything, but his brow furrowed slightly. Rachel felt a twinge of guilt, but she brushed it aside, telling herself he was just tired. Are you picking Bailey up from the groomer tomorrow? She asked as she got into bed. Yeah, he replied, without looking up from his laptop. Remind me in the morning. She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Eric had texted her earlier in the day. Tulsa is going to be fun. Ready for another round of music debates? She replied briefly, but his words were still swirling around in her head. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was skating on thin ice. At the office, working with Eric continued to be light and lively. They prepared for the trip to Tulsa, discussing slides and strategies. Eric was his usual self, joking, bringing coffee, doing everything to make her smile. One day, they stayed late in the conference room, reviewing the final version of the presentation. Are you sure we haven't overdone it with the schedules? He asked, leaning back in his chair. The sponsors might fall asleep. They won't fall asleep, Rachel replied, flipping through the slides. You'll be entertaining them with your army stories. Oh, I'm ready, he grinned. I'll tell you about the time I was stuck in the desert with 3 cans of tuna and no can opener. Rachel laughed, and her shoulders relaxed. She found herself at ease with Eric, at ease with him, at ease with her at home. He looked at her with interest, and it was like a sip of water after a long day. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Listen, he said as they packed up, we've got to celebrate after Tulsa. Let's find a bar with some decent music. No Springsteen, I promise. Hey, don't touch Springsteen, she replied, poking him in the shoulder. But I'll think about it. They left the office, and Eric offered to give her a ride. Rachel declined, but her heart was pounding as she climbed into her car. She turned on the radio to drown out her thoughts, but the song reminded her of the argument in Dallas, and she smiled despite herself. At home, Matt was in the kitchen making sandwiches. This was unexpected. He rarely cooked, especially on weekdays. Oh, cooking night? Rachel asked, throwing her bag on a chair. I decided to spoil you, he replied, but his smile was strained. How's your day? Fine, she said, sitting down at the table. Lots of work before Tulsa. Tulsa, huh? He set the plate in front of her. You go there a lot. Rachel froze, feeling his words hanging in the air. She looked at him, but he had already turned away, slicing bread. It's for work, she replied, trying to sound calm. Conferences, sponsors, you know. I know, he said, but his voice was even almost cold. He sat down across from her, and they ate in silence. Rachel felt his eyes studying her, but he said nothing. The next day, she noticed Matt was more attentive. He asked what time she'd be back, checked where her keys were, even offered to help with Bailey. Rachel chalked it up to him being tired, but something about his behavior made her nervous. She started hiding her phone when he was around and set a new password on her laptop. She told herself it was just a precaution, but every time she opened Signal, her heart sank. Eric noticed her tension as they prepared for the trip. Are you okay? He asked as they drank coffee before their meeting. You look like you're studying for an exam. Just a lot to do, she said, avoiding his gaze. Tulsa's going to be busy. Relax, he said, touching her hand lightly. We'll get through this, as always. Rachel smiled, but his touch left a mark that she felt all day. She knew she had gone too far, but it was getting harder to stop. Eric was like a magnet, and every look, every joke he made pulled her in tighter. At home, Matt became quieter. He no longer asked about her work, but Rachel noticed him looking at her phone when she left it on the table. One evening, she came out of the shower and found him with her laptop. What are you doing? She asked, trying not to show her panic. Just checking to see if the browser was up to date, he replied, closing the lid. You know how yours always freezes. Yeah, she said, but her voice was shaking. She picked up the laptop and went into the bedroom, her palms sweating. Before the trip to Tulsa, Matt helped her pack her bag. He folded her things neatly, as he had done before, but his movements were slow, as if he were considering something. Good luck there, he said as she left. Call me when you get there. Of course, she replied, kissing his cheek, but his gaze was heavy, and she felt her heart squeeze. In Tulsa, she and Eric worked nonstop, but in the evenings they found time to sit at a bar. They talked, they laughed, and Rachel felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew it was wrong, but with Eric it was easy, without the burden of guilt she carried at home. When she returned, Matt met her at the door. He hugged her, but his embrace was colder than usual. How did the conference go? He asked, looking into her eyes. Okay, she replied, trying to smile. A lot of work, but everything went smoothly. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. Rachel felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, and her fingers trembled. She went into the bathroom to check the message. Eric wrote, Tulsa was awesome. You're a star. She smiled, but quickly deleted the message, guilt tightening in her chest. Later, when they went to bed, Matt turned to her. "Rachel," he said quietly, "you would have told me if something was wrong, right?" She froze, feeling her heart pounding in her ears. "Of course," she answered, but her voice was barely audible. Rachel walked into the house, shaking rain off her jacket. The Austin May downpour had turned the streets into rivers, and her shoes were soaking wet. She'd just returned from Tulsa, where the conference had gone better than she'd expected, but her thoughts weren't on the sponsors. They were on Eric, his easy smile, their late-night bar conversations. Bailey greeted her at the door, tail wagging, and she crouched down to scratch his ear, trying not to think about what awaited her inside. Matt was sitting on the couch, holding a mug of coffee. The TV was off, and the living room was unusually quiet. His gaze was calm, but there was something about it that made Rachel's stomach churn. She took off her jacket and hung it on a hook, feeling her heart beat faster. "Hello," she said, trying to smile. "The weather is terrible. How are you?" "Fine," he said, but his voice was flat, almost mechanical. He set the mug down and looked at her. "How's Tulsa?" "Okay," Rachel shrugged, throwing her bag on a chair. "The sponsors are happy. The project is moving forward." Matt nodded, but didn't look away. She could feel his eyes following her every move, and it made her tense. She went into the kitchen to get some water, but her fingers shook as she picked up the glass. "Rachel," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "can I borrow your phone for a minute?" She froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. She turned to him, trying to remain calm. "Why?" she asked, trying to smile. "Do you want to order pizza?" "Just give it to me," he said, and there was no malice or humor in his tone. He stood up from the couch and stepped toward her. Rachel felt her heart sink. She wanted to laugh it off, say something light like she used to, but his gaze was like a steel bolt. She slowly pulled her phone out of her pocket and placed it on the table, but her hand shook. "Matt, what's going on?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He picked up the phone without answering and punched in the password. Rachel wanted to protest, to say it was her privacy, but the words caught in her throat. She knew he would find it. The signal was open, and even though she'd deleted the messages, she wasn't sure she'd deleted everything. Matt was silent, scrolling, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. "Who is Eric?" he asked finally, looking up. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Rachel felt her cheeks heat up. She opened her mouth to respond, but everything she could come up with sounded like a lie. "A colleague," she said, swallowing. "We're working on a project together." "A colleague," Matt repeated, his lips pressed into a thin line. He turned the phone toward her, showing her a photo of her and Eric at a team barbecue, their heads close, her hand on his shoulder. "Does that work too?" Rachel looked at the photo and her stomach dropped. She remembered that night, nothing serious, just laughter and beer, but it seemed different now. "It was just," she began, but Matt interrupted. "No need," he said, his voice cold. "I found the voicemails. Miss you, Rachel. You recorded miss you for him, and a hotel reservation in Dallas, in your name." She felt the ground shift beneath her. She wanted to explain, to say that it was a mistake, that she didn't mean for it to go this far, but his gaze stopped her. There was no anger in it, only pain, and that was worse. "Matt, she began, but he raised his hand. "No," he repeated, "I don't want to hear it." He put the phone down on the table and walked past her, heading for the door. Rachel grabbed his arm, but he gently but firmly pulled away. "I need to think," he said, not looking at her. "I'll spend the night at Dan's." "Matt, wait," her voice broke. "Let's talk. Please." He stopped at the door, but did not turn around. "You could have talked to me earlier," he said quietly, "before all this." The door slammed, and Rachel was alone. Bailey ran up to her, nuzzling her knee, but she barely noticed him. She sank down on the couch, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to run after Matt, but her legs felt like lead. Instead, she picked up her phone and opened Signal. The last message from Eric was innocuous. "Are you back? How was your trip?" She deleted it, and then the entire chat, but it didn't help. Everything was already ruined. The next day Matt returned in the morning. He looked like he hadn't slept, but his voice was calm. "I've spoken to a lawyer," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. "We're filing for divorce. The grounds are adultery." Rachel felt her heart stop. She wanted to argue, to say that they could fix this, but his gaze was unreadable. "Matt, I didn't mean to," she began, but he shook his head. "I don't want to discuss it," he said. "I just want it to be over." He went into the bedroom, and Rachel remained in the kitchen, clutching her mug of cold tea. Bailey lay down at her feet, and she stroked him, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew she was guilty, but the knowledge only made the pain worse. She remembered their wedding, his vows, their evenings on the porch, and it all seemed distant now, like someone else's life. At the office, she tried to keep it together. Eric noticed her tension and asked if everything was okay, but she brushed him off, saying she was just tired. She avoided his eyes, afraid he would see her guilt. She kept working, but every call, every report seemed empty. She felt like she was losing everything she had spent years building. At home, Matt was coldly businesslike. They talked only about what was necessary. Bailey, the bills, who would pick up the mail. Rachel tried to make conversation, but he kept his answers short, avoiding her eyes. One evening, she found him in the living room, sorting through old photographs of them. He held up a picture from their wedding, his fingers frozen on it. "Matt," she said quietly, sitting down next to him, "can we talk?" He looked at her, and there was weariness in his eyes. "What about, Rachel?" he asked. "You already said it all, in those messages." She swallowed, feeling her throat tighten. "It's my fault," she said. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I love you." He shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. "Did you love me when you wrote to him?" he asked. "When did you spend the night with him in Dallas?" Rachel wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. She knew he was right, and there was no point in making excuses. Matt stood up, leaving the photo on the table, and went into the bedroom. Rachel picked up the picture of them laughing, holding hands, with Puget Sound in the background. She held it to her chest, feeling tears dripping onto the paper. A few days later, an envelope arrived from her lawyer. She opened it with trembling hands and read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The words were like a blow. She sat in the kitchen, staring at the paper, until Bailey nuzzled her hand. She hugged him, burying her face in his fur, and cried, realizing that everything she built with Matt was falling apart because of her own mistake. She tried calling Eric, but he didn't answer. She texted him, but his messages went unread. She felt lost, like everything that had kept her going was gone. Matt was sleeping in the spare room, and their home, once full of laughter, felt like a stranger. Rachel lay in bed, clutching her pillow and closing her eyes, hoping sleep would take her away from this pain. But even in her sleep, she saw his face, not Eric's, but Matt's, and the disappointment in his eyes. Rachel stood in the living room, boxes piling up against the walls. The house with the red porch, once her and Matt's nest, now looked like a warehouse before a move. It had been a month since the night he'd found Eric's texts, and their lives had fallen apart. She clutched a letter from her lawyer with the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," written in black and white. The words burned her fingers, and she threw the envelope on the table, trying not to look at it. Matt walked in carrying a box of books. His face was tired, the shadows under his eyes were deeper. He set the box down and looked at Rachel, avoiding her gaze. "These are your sociology books," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I folded them separately. You can have them." "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely audible. She wanted to say something else, but her throat tightened and she simply nodded. They began dividing things up. It felt strange, putting their lives into boxes, as if they were a collection of old things no one wanted. Rachel took the dishes, her books, and a few photographs she couldn't keep. Matt took the tools, the coffee maker, and half the furniture. They spoke briefly, matter-of-factly, like strangers negotiating the sale of a garage. "What about the furniture in the living room?" Matt asked, standing by the couch where they'd once watched movies and eaten nachos. "Should we sell it?" "I think so," Rachel replied, looking at the empty pillows. "I won't take him into the apartment." Matt nodded, jotting something down on his phone. Then he crouched down to pet Bailey, who was lying by the door, whining. The dog was looking at them, as if he understood what was happening. "I'll take Bailey," Matt said, not looking up. "I'll have a yard, he'll be happier there. You can visit if you want." Rachel felt her heart clench. She loved Bailey, his warm fur, his habit of nuzzling her lap. But she knew Matt was right. Her new apartment in East Austin was tiny, with no yard, and Bailey would be cramped. "Okay," she said, swallowing. "Just take care of him." "Sure," Matt said, his voice softer than usual. He scratched Bailey behind the ear, and the dog licked his hand. Rachel turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. She went into the kitchen to put the dishes away, but her hands were shaking. She knew she wasn't just losing Bailey, but a part of the life they had built together. She wanted to tell Matt she was sorry, that she hadn't meant to ruin everything, but his coldness stopped her. Matt's lawyer sent the papers, and Rachel signed them without reading them. Infidelity was a blow, but she couldn't argue. She tried to talk to Matt, to explain that Eric was a mistake, but he brushed her off every time. "Rachel, stop it," he said one day as they were clearing out the dishes in the kitchen. "This won't change anything." "Matt, I didn't mean to," she began, her voice shaking. "I was confused. I didn't know how to." "You knew," he interrupted, his voice cold but calm. "You knew when you wrote to him, when you went with him." Rachel clutched the plate so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream that she loved him, that Eric was just an escape from their tiredness, but his eyes were like a wall. She put the plate back in the box and turned away, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but he had already gone into another room. Rachel was left alone, staring at the empty kitchen. She remembered how she and Matt had made tacos here, how he had laughed when sauce had gotten on his shirt. It all seemed foreign now, like a memory from another life. She sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands, and tried to breathe evenly. Friends began to drift away. Dan and Martha, their neighbors, tried to be neutral, but Rachel saw them avoid her eyes when she mentioned the divorce. Her friend Liz called from Ohio, trying to be supportive. "Ratch, how are you?" Liz asked, her voice full of concern. "Trying to hold myself together," Rachel said, looking at the boxes in the living room. "We're dividing things. Matt's taking Bailey." "Oh, Ratch," Liz sighed. "This sucks. But you're strong. You can do this." Rachel wanted to believe, but every time she saw Matt, her confidence waned. He was polite but distant, as if she were just a colleague and not the wife he had spent 10 years with. They had agreed to sell the house, and the realtor was already showing buyers around. Rachel watched strangers touch their walls and felt her heart clench. One evening, Matt came by to pick up the last of his things. He was carrying a box of his old t-shirts and a coffee maker. Bailey was hanging around his feet, wagging his tail. "I found an apartment," he said, setting the box down by the door. "Downtown. Bailey will be comfortable there." Rachel nodded, clutching her mug of tea. She wanted to ask how he was coping, but her throat felt like it was in a vice. "Matt," she said finally, "you really don't want to talk? Maybe we could." "Rachel," he interrupted, his voice weary, "you made a choice. I'm just trying to move on with my life." She felt tears welling up, but forced herself to nod. "I understand," she said quietly. "Just take care of Bailey." "Always," he replied, his gaze softening as he looked at the dog. He took the leash, and Bailey jumped up happily, not realizing it was goodbye. When Matt left, Rachel was left in an empty house. She walked into the living room where only the old table they had decided to sell stood. She ran her fingers over its surface, remembering how she and Matt had eaten pizza here, laughing at his cooking failures. All that was in the past now. She sat on the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rachel found an apartment in East Austin Small with a tiny balcony and a view of her neighbor's fence. The move was quick. She took only clothes, books, and a few photographs. When she signed the lease, the realtor looked at her with mild sympathy. "A new start, huh?" he said, handing her the keys. "I hope so," Rachel replied, but her smile was strained. In the office, she tried to hold her own. Eric was still there, but she avoided him, afraid that any word would betray her pain. He noticed this and stopped her in the hallway one day. "Rachel, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "You don't seem you." "I'm just tired," she replied, looking at the floor. "A lot of work." "If anything happens, I'm here," he said, but she only nodded and left, not letting him continue. Work was no longer a lifesaver. Presentations, reports, phone calls, everything felt empty. She returned to her new apartment, where neither Bailey nor Matt was, and felt like an outsider. She tried calling Liz, but the conversations were short. Rachel didn't want to complain and didn't want to admit how much she missed their life. One day, she found an old photograph in a box, she and Matt at Lady Bird Lake, with their bikes and their smiles. She stared at it until tears began to fall onto the paper. She wanted to text Matt to ask how Bailey was, but she couldn't bring herself to. Instead, she put on some music, an old album they'd listened to together, and lay down on the couch, feeling the emptiness fill her. She closed her eyes, hoping tomorrow would be easier, but deep down she knew this was just the beginning. Rachel sat on the balcony of her new East Austin apartment, clutching a mug of cold tea. The streetlights cast a dim glow on the neighbor's fence, and the night smelled of dust and jasmine. It had been 2 months since Matt had taken Bailey and left her in the empty house with the red porch. Their divorce was nearing completion, but the pain still lingered in her chest like an uninvited guest. She tried calling Eric, hoping he would help her forget, but his number was not answering and her signal messages remained unread. She stared at the dark screen of her phone, feeling the loneliness tighten in her throat. Everything had changed at the office. Eric had disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. Rachel had learned from a colleague of Tom's that he had been transferred to the California office, some urgent project he hadn't had time to tell her about. She was standing in the hallway when Tom broke the news, her fingers tightening on the report folder. "He left?" she asked again, trying to sound neutral. "When?" "Last week," Tom said with a shrug. "He said it was temporary, but who knows? He didn't say much." Rachel nodded, but her insides sank. She walked back to her desk, her cheeks burning. Eric hadn't texted, hadn't called, hadn't said goodbye. She remembered their nights at bars, his laughter, his warm gaze, and realized it had all been an illusion, a temporary escape she'd mistaken for something more. She opened Signal, but their chat was empty. She'd deleted it after her conversation with Matt. Now she regretted it, but she didn't know why. "Are you okay?" asked her colleague Sarah, noticing Rachel staring at the monitor without moving. "Yes," she replied, forcing a smile. "I was just thinking." Sarah nodded, but her eyes were pitying. Rachel hated it, the pity that followed her everywhere now. She stared at the reports, but the numbers and graphs blurred before her eyes. She felt empty, as if she had lost not only Matt, but a part of herself. At home, she tried to occupy herself. She unpacked boxes, hung an old map of Chicago on the wall, and put books on the shelf. But without Bailey, the apartment felt dead. She missed his whines, the warmth of his fur under her fingers. She texted Matt, asking how Bailey was, and he wrote back briefly, "It's okay. He's fine." She wanted to ask more, but his coldness stopped her. She threw her phone on the couch and turned on the TV to drown out the silence. One evening, she called Liz. Her friend from Ohio was the only person Rachel could talk to honestly. "Rach, how are you?" Liz asked. Her voice warmed despite the thousands of miles between them. "I don't know," Rachel admitted, lying on the couch. "Eric's gone. Matt, he won't even look at me. I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," Liz said, her tone firm. "You made a mistake. This isn't the end of the world, but you have to move on. What? Rachel clutched her pillow. I ruined everything. Matt, our home, even Bailey is with him now. You haven't destroyed yourself, Liz said. You're still Rachel, who argued with professors and made everyone laugh. Find her again. Rachel was silent, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to believe Liz, but she didn't know where to begin. After the call, she sat in the dark, staring at the map of Chicago on the wall. She remembered her and Matt's first argument in line, his thermos, their evenings at the library. It felt like another life, and she wasn't sure she could go back to that version of herself. At the office, she took on a new project, a veterans support program she had started with Eric. She worked with renewed vigor, as if she could numb the pain. But every time she saw his empty desk, her heart sank. She tried texting him, but his number was out of range and his messages weren't getting through. She began to think he'd left not just for work, but to escape her. One night, she was staying late at the office, finalizing a report. Sarah peeked into her office, holding 2 cups of coffee. Are you still here? She asked, placing one of the glasses in front of Rachel. Time to go home, heroine. Soon, Rachel replied, not looking up from the screen. We need to finish this. You always say that. Sarah sat down across from him. Look, I don't want to pry, but you look like you haven't slept in a week. Rachel looked at her, her smile tight. Just a lot of things, she said, sipping her coffee. Divorce, you know. Sarah nodded, her gaze soft. I know, she said. Mine went through this a couple of years ago. It's shitty, but you can handle it. Just give yourself time. Rachel nodded, but Sarah's words didn't help. She turned back to the report, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered Eric bringing her coffee, how they laughed at his army stories. Now it was like a dream she couldn't hold on to. At home, she began looking for ways to fill the void. She signed up for yoga, but skipped classes because she couldn't concentrate. She tried cooking new dishes, but the kitchen felt foreign without Matt and Bailey. One day, she found an old Foo Fighters album in a box that reminded her of her argument with Eric in Dallas. She played it, but the music only made her feel worse. She turned off the player and lay down on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She decided to text Matt to ask about Bailey. She typed a message. How is he? Does he miss me? But before she sent it, she deleted it. She knew Matt didn't want to talk, and that was her punishment. Instead, she called Martha, their former neighbor, hoping to hear something. Rachel, honey, how are you? Martha asked, her voice warm as always. I'm trying, Rachel said, clutching the phone. How's Matt and Bailey? They're fine, Martha said, but her tone was cautious. Matt's busy with work. Bailey's running around the yard like a puppy. He's in good hands. Rachel nodded, though Martha couldn't see her. She wanted to ask more, but she was afraid her voice would betray her pain. Thank you, she said. Tell Dan I said hi. Absolutely, Martha replied. And Rachel, hang in there. Rachel hung up and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She hadn't cried like this since the night Matt left. She hugged her pillow, but it didn't help without Bailey. She remembered the way Eric had looked at her at the bar, the way his voice had sounded on her voicemails, and she realized he had been a mirage. Their connection had been fueled by adrenaline, by novelty, but now that he was gone, she was left with nothing. She stood up and walked to the balcony, looking out over the dark courtyard. She thought about Matt, the way he had stroked Bailey, the cold look in his eyes the last time they had talked. She knew she had lost him because of her mistake, and that was the worst thing. She wanted to text Eric, to yell at him why he had left without a word, but instead she just looked at the stars, feeling the loneliness wash over her. The next day she went to the office, but her mind was scattered. She was sitting in a meeting when Tom mentioned that Eric might be staying in California for a long time. Rachel nodded, but her fingers were clenched so tightly around her pen that she almost broke it. She realized that their affair was not only a mistake, but also an illusion she had created to escape her problems. That evening, she returned to her apartment and opened her laptop. She started to write a letter to Liz, but stopped. Instead, she found the website of a local shelter for animals and signed up to volunteer. She needed something to fill the void, something to remind her of who she was. She closed her laptop and lay down on the couch, listening to the silence. She knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny spark of hope. She closed her eyes, imagining herself petting a dog at the shelter, and thought that maybe this would help her find herself. Rachel stood outside the Austin County Courthouse, clutching a folder of papers. The December air was crisp, and her breath was steaming. The judge had just signed off on her maiden name, Blake. The divorce was final, her 10-year affair with Matt officially over. She stepped outside, and the smell of fresh tacos from the grocery cart nearby filled her nose. She took a deep breath, trying to feel anything but empty air, but her legs felt like rubber. She walked to her car, not looking back at the courthouse. In her East Austin apartment, Rachel dropped her keys on the table and collapsed on the couch. The apartment was small, with bare walls that she hadn't yet decorated. Without Bailey, the silence was deafening. She remembered Matt picking him up, the dog wagging his tail happily, not understanding that their family had been torn apart. She texted Matt, asking about Bailey, and he wrote back briefly, "He's okay, running around the yard." She wanted to text more, but her fingers froze over the screen. She dropped the phone on the pillow and closed her eyes. Her friend Liz called almost every day, trying to get her out of this state. "Ratch, you can't stay in this apartment forever," Liz said, her voice firm but warm. "Go somewhere. Do something for yourself." "I'm trying," Rachel said, looking at her empty coffee mug. "I just don't know where to start." "Start small," Liz said. "Enroll in a class, or go to a shelter. You love animals." Rachel nodded, even though Liz couldn't see her. After the call, she opened her laptop and found the website of a local animal shelter. She signed up to volunteer, not really believing it would help, but feeling like she had to do something. The next day, she drove to the shelter, and the smell of dog hair and bleach greeted her at the entrance. "Are you new?" asked a woman named Claire, who ran the shelter. She was short, with short gray hair and a smile that seemed genuine. "Yeah," Rachel said, adjusting her jacket. "Rachel, I want to try to help." "Great," Claire said, handing her the leash. "Let's start with a walk. This is Luna. She likes walks, but she doesn't like cats." Rachel took the leash, and Luna, a shaggy mongrel with big eyes, looked at her hopefully. They walked outside, and Rachel felt her shoulders relax. Luna tugged on the leash, sniffing every bush, and Rachel laughed when the dog almost dragged her into a ditch. "You remind me of a dog," she said, scratching Luna behind the ear. "Only he was lazier." She spent every Saturday at the shelter. She walked the dogs, cleaned the cages, helped with the food. Claire told her stories about each animal, and Rachel found herself smiling more than she did at home. One day, she was sitting on the grass with Luna when Claire approached her. "You're doing well," Claire said, sitting down next to him. "Do you have a dog?" Rachel hesitated, looking at Luna. "He was," she answered quietly. "Now he's with my ex-husband." Claire nodded without asking questions. "They take a piece of your heart, don't they?" she said. "But here you can give them a little of yours." Rachel smiled, feeling warmth in her chest. She petted Luna, and the dog licked her hand like Bailey did. It wasn't the same, but it was something. Rachel began teaching herself to play bass guitar in the evenings. She bought a used instrument at a garage sale and found tutorials on YouTube. Her fingers hurt, and the sound was terrible for the first few weeks, but she kept going. She sat on the balcony, strumming the strings, trying not to think about Matt and how he would laugh at her attempts. One day she called Marta, their former neighbor, to find out the news. "Rachel, it's good to hear from you," Martha said, her voice warm. "How are you?" "I'm trying," Rachel said, looking at the guitar in the corner. "How's Matt and Bailey?" "Matt's gone to Dallas," Martha said. "He says he wants to start his own startup. Bailey's with him, running around the new yard like a puppy." Rachel nodded, feeling a pang in her chest. She was happy for Matt, but the thought of him moving on while she was still floundering was painful. "Thank you," she said. "Tell Dan I said hi." "Sure," Martha replied. "And Rachel, come over sometime. We miss you." Rachel hung up and looked at her guitar. She picked it up and began to play a simple tune she had learned the day before. The sound was uneven, but she kept going until her fingers found a rhythm. It was the first thing she had done for herself in a long time, and it felt like a small step forward. She continued working at the office, but without the same zeal. The Veterans Fund project was going well, but without Eric, it was different. She learned from Tom that he was still in California, which only confirmed her thoughts. Their connection was a mirage she had created to escape her problems with Matt. She stopped trying to contact him, deleted Signal, and focused on work. One day, Sarah, her colleague, invited her to dinner. "Stop hiding in the office," Sarah said, handing her a glass of wine at the restaurant. "Tell me what's new." Rachel shrugged, twirling her glass in her hands. "Nothing special," she said. I go to the shelter. I'm learning to play the bass guitar." "Bass guitar?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's cool. You should play us something." "Only if you want to go deaf," Rachel replied, and they both laughed. Dinner with Sarah was the first time in a long time that Rachel felt almost normal. They chatted about work, about music, about life in Austin. Rachel even told her about the moon, and Sarah listened without interrupting. "You know," Sarah said as they left the restaurant, "you're stronger than you think. You've been through hell, and you're still here." Rachel smiled, but her eyes were wet. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm trying." At home, she continued playing guitar. She learned a few chords and even tried writing her own melody. It was awkward, but she didn't care. She sat on the balcony, looking at the stars, and played until her fingers ached. She thought about Matt, about Bailey, about how things could have been different, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she was drowning in wine. She began going to the shelter more often. Luna became her favorite, and Claire joked that the dog was waiting for her every Saturday. One day, Luna ran away during a walk, and Rachel chased her around the park until they both fell on the grass, breathless with laughter and barking. "You're impossible," Rachel said, hugging the dog. "But I love you." Claire looked at them and smiled. "Maybe you should take her," she asked. "She's clearly yours." Rachel shook her head, though her heart sank. "I can't," she said. "My apartment is too small, but I'll come." She went home and lay on the couch, staring at the map of Chicago on the wall. She remembered Matt calling her Ohio, arguing about pizza, proposing to her in the mountains. The memories still hurt, but their edges were beginning to soften. She realized she'd learned something, to talk about problems when they were small, and not to seek refuge in illusions, as she had with Eric. She picked up her guitar and played a tune she had learned. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She looked out the window at the stars and felt that maybe tomorrow would be easier. She closed her eyes, listening to the silence of her new life, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled without pretending. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.